We finished the first month of this 11-month program in Chicago, and the next place we were heading for was Bliss Electrical School in Tacoma Park, Maryland, which was just maybe 10 or 15 miles north of Washington, D.C. But as opposed to where I had been in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, going to school in the afternoon after the first class of boys had finished their morning studies. This was all a Navy place, to the extent that they had a naval band stationed at the base, and we had days where we marched around Bliss Electrical School following a band, and it felt, I don't know, it felt more like being in the Navy. But as far as the study went, it was pretty similar to the 3 months that I had spent in Lancaster for the Signal Corps. So I didn't feel any pressure about the work. I knew in general pretty much, I understood what was going on. Again, I was helping Stanley, who had done quite well in Chicago and was ready to take up the more advanced work that was going to happen at Bliss Electrical School. Anyway, the weather was beautiful, the place was very nice, and I even enjoyed marching for a change with the naval band. Everything went along nicely, easily. As a matter of fact, we had a day or two off in the middle period after 6 weeks, and I asked Babe to come down from New York, which was a pretty easy trip by train, and she spent a weekend there. We rented a room in a small house, and we had 2 days of extended honeymoon that we had missed after we got married. And it was really quite idyllic, lovely time for both of us. Anyway, after that, it was back to school, back to the band and marching. And 6 weeks later, at the end of 3 months work there, we finished that phase of our program. And as yet, there had been no word about radar. We were still dealing with radio and the basics of how a radio worked, and that was leading us up to the work that we would do for the last 6 months, where we learned what radar was all about and the kind of equipment the United States had in as far as a wartime effort. Anyway, we finished that 3 months towards the end of July. We had been there for May, June, and Well, part of the end of April through May and June, and finishing the last week in July, and getting ready for the next phase, the last phase of 6 months of radar. We had a choice of programs we could choose. We had a choice of going to Treasure Island in California, where we understood that you would learn about the radar that went on aircraft carriers. And that was one choice. The other choice, and that was attractive, the idea of being out in California, etc., and nice weather. The other two choices consisted of going to Bethesda, which was outside of Washington. It was in Maryland. And if you went there, you studied for the naval work of radar that was on battleships. And that sounded interesting. The third choice was Corpus Christi, Texas. It was the Naval Air Station there. If you went there, you learned about radar that was carried and used by naval warplanes. And that sounded interesting, but especially when I went into the details of it. If you were at Corpus Christi and you were married, you could live off the base. So that was one attraction. And one that seemed very important, because Babe could come down and we could spend my last 6 months of schooling together, living off the base. And I think they gave us a choice of the 3 places that you could go to, depending on your standing in the class, how your grades were. Well, I was very high, and so I had my choice of the 3 places. And after talking with Babe about it, we decided that I would choose Corpus Christi, Texas. The next part of this was Stanley. We had become very close friends in 4 months, and we wanted to continue together, so it was a question about whether he could get into the Corpus Christi group. And that was up for grabs. We didn't know what would happen, but evidently Corpus Christi wasn't as high on the list for the other students, because the idea of going to Corpus Christi at the end of July to a place that was hot, humid, and didn't have air conditioning in those days, didn't seem to be as attractive as the other 2 places. So whatever, I don't know how many chose the various places, but Stanley had chosen Corpus, and he was ordered to go there with me and a third of the group that was at Bliss Electrical School. We probably spent a day or two finishing up at Bliss and getting ready to go, and we were told that we were going by train to Corpus Christi. By this time it was, I think, July 30th, and we got our gear together and went to the railroad station expecting to find sleeper cars. Not only weren't there sleeper cars, what they had for us were cattle cars. Actually, freight cars that looked like they were used for shipping stuff. They had no windows, they had sliding doors, and they were hooked up to a steam engine that was going to pull us from there to Corpus Christi. And when we got a look at what the accommodations were in these cars, it was pretty simple, plain. These were freight cars that had triple-decker bunks set up in them. There was no bathroom and no running water. It was absolutely the most basic kind of transportation that you could think of. But we're in the Navy, you got to take orders, so we climbed in, and with our bags, our sea bags, and our sea bag, which was still in the hammock, and set forth, and we were told that we were heading for New Orleans, and we would expect to arrive in New Orleans by midnight. And that the train would stop probably every 4 hours so that we could use the bathrooms at a station where they would stop, get some water, stretch a bit, and then continue on for another 4 hours to the next station where we would stop, etc. The one thing we hadn't thought of when we started our trip was that we had no windows, so they left the sliding doors wide open, and we were behind a coal-burning engine, so the dust and the residue of the coal was flung backwards and into our through our open doors into the area in which we were trying to rest or sleep or wait or whatever. And being at the end of July, we were in our white uniforms, which quickly became less white. But they followed the schedule, stopping times to let us get off and pee or whatever. Occasionally there would be some vendors or other people selling sandwiches, the things that we could eat. I don't remember the selling part. Mostly, I guess, we got it for nothing. Some drinks and some sandwiches. Anyway, we traveled that way from the morning until midnight, when we ended up in New Orleans. And by that time, we were pretty well covered in coal dust. We waited for dawn or early morning, and we had one problem between us. Stanley had hurt his elbow, and he needed to get some attention for it. I don't remember what it was, but it was painful. He must have hit it in some way before we started the trip. But by the time we got to New Orleans, we thought that he really needed to see a doctor. So we asked where the nearest naval air station was and how to get there. And we were told that there was one not too far away, and we got a cab and went to this naval base. The first thing we did was take off our clothes, take a shower, and take our clothes and leave them in a corner because they weren't wearable anymore. We had taken a change of clothes with us, so we put on clean whites and clean underwear, clean socks, and wiped our shoes off. And Stanley was taken to the sick bay and had his elbow looked at, and it seemed to just be more of a surface problem, and they put a bandage over it and said that he was okay to travel. And we had been told when we left the station in New Orleans that morning that the next part of our trip we would have a regular train and no longer travel in those cattle cars. So we were looking forward to the rest of our trip. But in the meantime, we had almost a full day to spend in New Orleans, to go downtown to see the restaurants and bars, etc. And we asked for a good restaurant that we could go to, and what was told one of the nicest and best restaurants, whose name I can't recall right now. But we called and made a reservation for dinner there, and we didn't have to be back at the train station until about 11 p.m. So we had plenty of time. And after sightseeing, we went to this restaurant and had a very, very nice meal. Stanley was feeling better, and both of us were looking forward to the rest of this trip. And the only thing we hoped for was they had air conditioning in that train. Anyway, we went back in time, 11 p.m., found the train, was told which car we should go to. Unfortunately, it wasn't air conditioned, but at least it had seats and was fairly comfortable. And so we looked forward to the rest of our trip. We expected we would arrive in Corpus Christi sometime in the morning of the next day, leaving New Orleans at 11 or 12 o'clock at night. We arrived in Corpus Christi in the morning of the next day. I think it was July 31st, and it was very, very hot, and we could smell the oil wells and equipment that was drilling there. And we were driven from the station to a place called the Naval Air Base at Corpus Christi, and we were going to be spending our time and going to school at a place called Ward Island, which was a small island halfway out from Corpus Christi to the Naval Air Base, which was at the end of this peninsula. We were taken in, shown our barracks, told to rest up, and that the following morning we should report to the barracks center, where we would be told what our duties would be for the next 2 weeks. It seems like they had a setup in which when you went to school for 6 months, you didn't do any of the jobs on the base, which consisted of grounds work, cleaning up, kitchen duties, like working in the kitchen, helping the cooks or doing the dishes. So all of that work was done at your first 2 weeks of stay on the island, Ward Island. And once you got through those 2 weeks, you wouldn't have any onerous duties or guard duties, which was part of the duties, while you were going to school. And that seemed to make sense to me. I wasn't too happy about the first 2 weeks, but it seemed to make sense. Anyway, we assembled in the open area, and our names were called, and we were assigned various jobs. My job was helping to build a soccer field. That is to clear, first thing we had to do was clear the grass, the mesquite, the brambles, whatever was growing in this area, and eventually get it set up so that grass could be planted there, and they would have a soccer field to use when people wanted to play. Now, I was not used to that kind of work, and not only that, I wasn't used to being out in that kind of temperature on a field. On August 31st in Corpus Christi, Texas, with the sun overhead and the temperature in the high 90s, and since it was right off the Corpus Christi Bay, it was very humid. I would say it was a hellish kind of prospect. But I went out with the other people in my detail to this field, and we were given hoes and rakes and pickaxes and told to get to work. Well, I not only didn't know what to do with a pickaxe and a hoe and a rake, but it was extremely uncomfortable out there. Nevertheless, I followed. There was a bosun's mate who was directing our crew, and he got us started. And I started with a rake and a pickaxe to clean this desolate area. And after a half hour, my hands were bleeding, and I was ready to drop from the heat, and I said, I don't think I'm going to do this. So they hadn't taken our names, and the bosun's mate didn't know the names of the men in his detail. So I went back to the barracks, which got me out of the sun and the heat and this detail, and I decided that I wouldn't go back till they made me. And I continued to hide in the barracks for the next 2 weeks and never went back to this detail, which probably saved my life. And there were things going on in the barracks like card games and ping pong and other stuff. So as long as nobody missed me out there on the job and nobody caught me in the barracks when I wasn't supposed to be there, I was okay, and I lasted the 2 weeks and came out alive. I lasted okay, staying hidden, and going to the bathroom very often when anybody was around instead of just hanging out in the open area. But finally, after 2 weeks, our classes were assigned, and I found out that the 6 months would consist of learning different kinds of equipment that was used in airplanes, such as radar altimeters, radar search gear, radar bombing equipment, LORAN, which was long-range navigation, and several others. I guess it was rounded up into 12 sections of 2 weeks each, and consisted of half the time being spent in a lecture period and half the time spent in lab rooms working on the equipment. So typically you would go to the lecture first for a couple of hours, and the instructor would tell you the basic kinds of things that this piece of equipment could do and how it worked when it was working well. And then they sent you to a lab room in small groups, about 6 people to a group in the lab, where there would be a lab instructor who would show you the insides of this piece of equipment, and again tell you how everything was supposed to work. In those days, we didn't have transistors or condensers. Well, we had condensers, but not transistors. So the insides of this equipment mostly consisted of resistors, condensers, and tubes. Called them radio tubes. And you learned how it worked, and in the first week, and then the second week, in the lecture part, the instructor would tell you of things that might go wrong with this piece of equipment and how you would go about fixing it. And then you went to the lab, and the lab instructor would follow up on these things and eventually put some trouble on the equipment and ask you to find and fix it. It was a good way to learn, and we did learn a lot in fairly short order. 2 weeks on a piece of equipment was not too much to spend, but certainly enough to get acquainted with how it worked and how to fix problems. And most of the problems would be the radio tubes that would go out of order, stop working, and how that would show up, and then you would try to figure out which tube you had to deal with. So it was interesting, and this was something that I hadn't seen before, and so I was learning together with the other fellows there. We continued this for, I have to tell you about the sleeping arrangements, because I was living off the base, because I was married, and my wife was coming, and not only that, but she came with her mother because her father had died a couple of weeks prior to this, and they decided to, both of them would come and stay with me for the 6 months that I would be in Corpus Christi. Ray to recover from losing a husband, and Babe to be with me, and to have 6 months together before I went out to sea. My problem was, before they came, was to find some place for us to live in. Corpus Christi had gone from a small town to a big city in less than a year, and all available housing was taken up, so there wasn't anything available. And I had this job. They're coming, but where am I going to put them? So I went to the synagogue in Corpus Christi and asked to see the person who was in charge of looking of supplying or looking for rooms or helping other Jews. And I found this man, and in a day or so, he let me know that there was a house available that consisted of 3 bedrooms, a bathroom, kitchen, porch, and a 4th bedroom that was occupied by the owner, who wanted to continue living there, but wouldn't use the other rooms, just that one room to sleep in. I think that room had its own bathroom, so that we would have a whole apartment with a bathroom for ourselves and a kitchen for ourselves. And I found out that I think it was about $80 a month, which sounds silly now, but in those days that was a fair amount of rent to pay. So I went and looked at it, and it looked okay, and I told my mother-in-law and my wife that I had found a place and to come ahead. When Babe and Ray arrived with their luggage, I was able to take them to this house that we had. I think it was 2011 Palm Drive. And the house looked pretty good, and inside was all right. They had had a long day, and so I think we went out for dinner, and after dinner went to our respective bedrooms and went to sleep. In the morning, we compared what had happened to us, and all of us had not slept well because we heard little creatures walking around, and we were disturbed by them. And when we got up and looked in the morning, we found all kinds of creatures like beetles and cockroaches in sight. So we said, well, we can't stay here. And we spoke to the woman about it, and she said, yeah, I guess I was planning to have the place fumigated, but to do that, we have to get a fumigation company. They have to tent the structure, and we all have to move out for 2 days, because you can't stay here with the gas in the rooms. So we didn't have much choice. We called the Driscoll Hotel, which was brand new and beautiful, and made reservations, 2 rooms for 2 days, and moved there. And the place was tented and fumigated. We enjoyed the hotel, and the house needed fumigation. While we had time in the hotel, I heard the story of what had happened to Babe and Ray on the way down. Their train ride had a stopover in San Antonio, and they had a sleepover there. And when they were shown to their room, Ray saw a cockroach. And she called down, she said, we can't stay here, you gotta get us another room. The clerk said, why? He said, well, we saw a cockroach in this room. So the clerk said, lady, we've got cockroaches in all the rooms. So there was no sense in them moving. But anyway, that was their introduction to Texas. So when they found the creatures in our house that at 2011 Palm Drive, they weren't so surprised. Well, we enjoyed the 2 days at the Driscoll Hotel, and when we went back, we found that there were dead things all over, under all the chairs, under all the beds, but nothing moving or alive. So it was simply a question of sweeping up and cleaning up. But for the next 6 months that we were there, we never had another thing crawling or creeping around. So it was a question of being very careful with what you brought into the house. If you went shopping and got groceries, you had to empty that shopping bag outside into clean stuff that didn't have anything in it. And if you were careful and keeping stuff in the refrigerator or in bags that were clean, we kept all these animals away, and Babe and Ray were happy in staying there.